At its peak, Studebaker was one of America's largest car makers. The main plant sat on more than 100 acres in South Bend, Indiana. 23,000 people worked there. Today, it is a business park, a technical college, and a museum on the corner. No plaque marks where the assembly line ran. For 111 years, that patch of ground on the west side of South Bend built the wagons that carried the Union Army through the Civil War, the carriages that carried Presidents Lincoln, Grant, Harrison, and McKinley, and the automobile that designer Raymond Loewy would count among the finest work of his life. Then the decisions began. A merger with a dying luxury brand from Detroit, arranged by men who had not read the other side's books closely enough. Labor contracts signed in the good years, honored through the bad. A flagship car built on a fiberglass body by a company that did not yet know how to mold fiberglass at scale, rushed into production and returned to dealers in droves. By March 1966, Studebaker no longer built automobiles anywhere in the world. The Hamilton, Ontario plant that had carried on for 2 years after South Bend went still for the last time. The tooling was auctioned. The name was sold. The Avanti, the last car Studebaker made, was hand-built by successor after successor for another 40 years, each one slightly smaller, slightly poorer, slightly further from South Bend, until the last of them quietly closed too. This is the story of 5 brothers from Ohio who came to Indiana with a blacksmith shop and built what was, for a time, the largest wagon manufacturer on earth, who bet the whole company on the automobile in 1902 and won for 6 decades before losing everything in 10, and of the decisions that piece by piece took it all apart. On February 16, 1852, Henry and Clement Studebaker opened their blacksmith and wagon repair shop at 104 Michigan Street in South Bend, Indiana. They started with $68 in cash, 2 coal forges, and a basic set of hand tools. The work was local, hard-won, and manual. They shod horses for regional farmers, repaired timber frame plowshares, and built sturdy wooden farm wagons designed to survive the deep ruts of Midwestern dirt roads. The brothers built their early business on a simple foundation. Wood had to be seasoned properly, iron tires had to be shrunk tight onto oak wheels, and every weld had to hold. By 1858, their brother John Moeller Studebaker returned from the California goldfields. He did not bring gold dust, but rather $8,000 earned by hand-making durable wooden wheelbarrows for miners in Placerville. He bought out Henry's share of the shop, providing the capital needed to buy raw timber, coal, and bar iron in bulk. Soon, brothers Peter and Jacob joined the enterprise, dividing the duties of production, finance, and regional sales. This family alliance transformed a small-town smithy into a serious industrial concern. The true test of their manufacturing scale arrived with the Civil War. The federal government, desperate for reliable transport, awarded the brothers major subcontracts to supply the Union Army. Between 1861 and 1865, the South Bend works produced thousands of wagons, gun caissons, and ambulances. They built the standard quartermaster wagon, number 112, and cavalry wagon number 7, using assembly methods that split the work into repeatable operations. By 1867, the company had delivered 6,000 heavy vehicles to the federal war effort. This military reliability earned the firm national prestige. Studebaker manufactured custom-built ceremonial carriages for some of the country's most prominent citizens, including Presidents Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, Benjamin Harrison, and William McKinley. Lincoln rode to the Ford's Theater in a Studebaker coach-type carriage on April 14, 1865. Long before the first rubber tire ever touched asphalt, the name on Michigan Street stood for the gold standard of American horse-drawn transit. The small smithy was gone, replaced by a massive production engine ready for whatever the next century would demand. In 1902, the South Bend assembly floors began hosting a quiet experiment, the first Studebaker Electric, a compact two-seater runabout built for short city trips. It was a cautious probe into a new era, but the company's leadership soon realized that batteries could not match the raw utility of gasoline. By 1904, they rolled out the Studebaker Model 1 at the Chicago Auto Show. Built in partnership with the Garford Company of Ohio, this first gasoline-powered model relied on a 12-horsepower, two-cylinder engine bolted to a rigid steel tube frame. This was not a tentative sideline. It was a deliberate, calculated retooling of a global manufacturing footprint. The company did not merely add an automotive branch. They systematically dismantled their historic core. By 1920, the last wooden horse-drawn wagon rolled out of the South Bend works. The oak seasoning sheds and blacksmith forges were cleared to make room for assembly lines, overhead conveyors, and massive metal stamping presses. Within 4 years, workers were assembling the Model A and Model G passenger cars on the very floors where Teamsters' wagons once stood. But the heavy capital costs of this transition collided with the Great Depression. In 1933, burdened by debt, Studebaker entered voluntary receivership. Survival required a different kind of precision, not in the tool room, but on the balance sheet. In 1935, Paul G. Hoffman assumed the presidency, partnering with board chairman Harold Vance. Hoffman, a seasoned executive with an eye for overhead, introduced a lean production discipline. He pruned weak product lines and negotiated a vital $30 million credit line. By the late 1930s, Studebaker was again posting a profit, establishing itself as the premier independent automaker standing outside Detroit's Big Three. They had survived the economic collapse by treating car building as a strict discipline of unit costs and manufacturing tolerances. But staying ahead of Ford and General Motors required more than just efficient assembly lines. It required a visual identity that would make every other car on the road look obsolete. On June 12, 1936, Studebaker signed a formal consulting agreement with industrial designer Raymond Loewy. It was a strategic decision to use styling as a competitive lever, giving the independent automaker a visual identity that stood entirely apart from Detroit's Big Three. Loewy's studio established a dedicated team in South Bend, working directly alongside the company's body engineers to translate clay concepts into production steel. The absolute peak of this design philosophy arrived with the 1953 Starliner Coupe. Penned by Bob Burke, a lead stylist in Loewy's group, the Starliner bypassed the heavy chrome-laden styling trends of the early 1950s. Instead, Burke used clean continental proportions, a low belt line, and a sloping hood that dropped between the front fenders like a modern jet. The design was recognized not just as a retail success, but as a monument of industrial art. The Museum of Modern Art in New York later added the 1953 Starliner to its permanent collection, securing its place in the national canon of exceptional American design. This aesthetic prestige was matched by massive industrial scale. During the early 1950s, the South Bend production complex was a sprawling engine of Midwestern manufacturing. The plant grounds covered more than 100 acres, packed with stamping presses, casting foundries, and overhead assembly lines. To keep these facilities running 3 shifts a day, Studebaker's local workforce reached approximately 23,000 employees. Toolroom foremen, machine operators, and draftspeople walked the floors of the Main Street and West Broadway buildings, backed by a tight regional network of local machine shops and suppliers. At this mid-century high-water mark, South Bend possessed both the artistic vision and the blue-collar muscle to challenge any automotive giant in the world. The company's identity was cast in iron and finished in high-gloss lacquer, radiating a quiet confidence that their independent path was secure. But maintaining this colossal industrial footprint required constant volume, and the margins of error were about to get dangerously thin. On October 1st, 1954, Studebaker legally combined with the Packard Motor Car Company of Detroit, forming the Studebaker-Packard Corporation. To the executives in the high-backed chairs, the math seemed clean. Harold Vance, Studebaker's president, and James Nance, his counterpart at Packard, designed the deal on a single premise: scale. In a market dominated by General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, they believed two struggling independents could survive by sharing the overhead of stamping presses, dealerships, and engine development. On paper, the combined entity boasted nearly $1 billion in annual sales, a figure meant to establish a viable fourth pillar in the American auto industry. It was a classic piece of mid-century boardroom optimism, the belief that if you bolt two leaking hulls together, the resulting vessel will somehow float. Studebaker's board believed they were acquiring Packard's high-margin luxury engineering and a reported cash reserve of $27 million. But the pre-merger audits had been rushed. Once the ink dried on the stock for stock swap, Studebaker's finance team began examining the actual ledgers. What they found was a series of quiet, compounding liabilities instead of a clean war chest. Packard's books concealed massive deferred tax obligations and underfunded employee pension plans, the very legacy of debt that would later trigger federal retirement reforms. That reported $27 million in cash was quickly swallowed by Studebaker's own $30 million of short-term debt. Ultimately, the merger solved the wrong problem. It traded operational independence for administrative mass without addressing the reality that neither firm possessed the modern tooling or the volume to survive a pricing fight with Detroit. By 1958, the Packard badge was quietly phased out. The legendary luxury nameplate, once the choice of presidents and kings, was reduced to a series of lightly disguised Studebakers before disappearing from showrooms entirely. Instead of creating a new giant, the alliance had simply tied two historic companies to the same sinking anchor. In 1955, the American showroom became a battleground of margins. Ford and General Motors launched a savage price war, cutting average vehicle prices by 5 to 7%. For the newly merged Studebaker-Packard, this was a structural trap. To a machinist, the math of a car is simple. It is a problem of tool wear, throughput, and setup time. In the mid-1950s, Detroit changed its sheet metal almost every year. A new design required new stamping dies, massive blocks of hardened steel that cost upwards of $2 million for a complete set. If you sell 1 million cars, you can write off that tooling cost in a few months, making the per-unit amortization negligible. But in South Bend, the calculation was different. Studebaker's press room was running on legacy iron, with stamping dies dating back to the mid-1940s. Dies are like drill bits, they do not last forever. The industry average for a major stamping die's mean time between overhauls was 4 years, but Studebaker was stretching its tooling past 8. Stamping dies run past their mechanical limits, lose their tolerances. The metal creeps, clearances widen, and body panels no longer fit cleanly. Workers on the assembly line had to spend extra time with lead solder and files just to get the doors to hang straight. Then came the labor arithmetic. A Studebaker required roughly 120 man-hours to assemble. The per-unit labor cost in 1955 averaged $58, weighed down by pre-war wage structures and old-fashioned multi-story plant layouts, where parts had to be moved via slow conveyors between floors. General Motors, with modern single-story plants and higher automation, averaged $46. When raw materials, worn tooling, and slow lines were factored in, a car built in South Bend cost about $1,350 to produce. The big three were building comparable models for $1,150. It turns out that while the financial architects believed combining two weak ledger books would magically conjure industrial efficiency, they forgot that paper mergers do not buy modern boring mills or high-speed hydraulic presses. Scale is not a boardroom philosophy, it is a physical law. By 1956, Studebaker-Packard was bleeding cash on every unit. The machines in South Bend were wearing out, the treasury was empty, and the room for error had shrunk to zero. In April 1962, Studebaker made its final bold play to capture the American imagination by announcing the Avanti sports coupe. The car was a desperate bid to inject high-velocity excitement into a brand fighting for its life. To bypass the multi-million-dollar cost of hard steel stamping dies, the board opted for a reinforced fiberglass body. Raymond Loewy coordinated the project, but the actual lines were penned by a design team consisting of Tom Kellogg, John Epstein, and Robert Andrews. They worked in secrecy, operating out of a rented ranch house in Palm Springs, California, to craft a low-drag, jet-age shape. But translating a Palm Springs clay model into a production vehicle in Indiana exposed the deep chasm between studio styling and plant execution. To build the complex fiberglass panels, Studebaker contracted the molded fiberglass companies of Ashtabula, Ohio, the same supplier that produced body parts for the Chevrolet Corvette. This is where paper plans met the reality of the shop floor. Fiberglass is a temperamental medium, demanding precise temperature controls and meticulous curing times. Almost immediately, the Ashtabula panels began arriving in South Bend with severe dimensional variations, sometimes off by as much as a quarter of an inch. Panels warped, surface finishes showed prominent waviness, and when workers tried to mate the bodies to the chassis, the parts did not fit. The archival record reveals a sharp, unresolved dispute over who was to blame. Studebaker's internal memos pointed directly at Ashtabula, accusing the supplier of sloppy quality control and slow delivery rates. Conversely, former engineers from molded fiberglass argued that Studebaker's design demanded tolerances far too tight for the wet layup fiberglass technology of 1962. While the engineers argued, the assembly lines ground to a halt. The company had to establish secondary assembly operations in South Bend just to shave, shim, and bond the mismatched body parts together by hand. Eager buyers who had placed deposits after the April announcement watched their delivery dates slip from weeks to months. Dealers, starved for cars, received vehicles that required extensive hours-long shop rework before they could be parked on the showroom floor. By the time the production lines began to move at a regular pace, thousands of frustrated buyers had already canceled their orders, taking their money to Chevrolet or Ford. The car designed to save Studebaker had instead consumed its most precious resource, time. On the morning of December 9, 1963, Studebaker's president, Byers Burlingame, announced a decision that ended more than a century of manufacturing in South Bend, Indiana. There was no styling, no public relations spin, and no boardroom optimism left. Burlingame plainly announced the immediate permanent shutdown of the South Bend automobile assembly plant, citing insurmountable financial pressures. On December 20, 1963, the final vehicle, a Lark Cruiser sedan, rolled off the line. When the last shift punched out that afternoon, the machinery inside the West Broadway and West Washington buildings went silent. The economic impact was direct and severe. The closure eliminated approximately 3,800 direct factory jobs, with the total layoff number eventually reaching nearly 8,000 employees, as administrative and support staff were let go. Within days, the loss of these wages began to strain municipal tax revenues and hollow out local retail spending. The damage moved quickly through the regional supply chain. Contracts for dozens of Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers vanished overnight, hollowing out tool and die shops and casting foundries throughout northern Indiana. Across the country, Studebaker's dealer network was cut off from its primary source of passenger cars. Starved for fresh inventory, hundreds of franchise owners closed their showrooms or took on other brands just to keep their service bays running. While the South Bend operations ended, Studebaker did not stop building cars entirely. The board consolidated all remaining vehicle assembly at their plant in Hamilton, Ontario, which had been operating since 1948. From Hamilton, a skeleton management team would try to support the surviving dealers while the parent corporation evaluated its position, but the industrial heart of the company had been permanently stopped. The Hamilton plant on Victoria Avenue North had been assembling Studebakers for the Canadian market since 1948. When the South Bend lines stopped in December 1963, this facility became the company's sole remaining vehicle assembly point. The Hamilton operation was a run-out phase. Canadian managers focused on a tight procedural process designed to squeeze whatever value remained from the existing tooling. Over the next 2 years, the model range steadily narrowed. High-performance engines, complex body options, and low-volume trim levels were systematically pruned from the schedule. By 1965, the line built only basic, practical passenger cars, utilizing purchased Chevrolet engines to keep production costs predictable. It was a cold exercise in manufacturing arithmetic, keeping the doors open just long enough to satisfy dealer commitments and clear out the remaining parts inventory. In March 1966, the math finally ran out. The last Studebaker to roll off the Victoria Avenue line was a cruiser sedan. When the final inspector signed the build sheet, the hand tools were put away, the overhead conveyor stopped, and the plant lights were turned off. This quiet shutdown in Hamilton closed an industrial run that had begun 114 years earlier, when two brothers first set their hands to seasoned oak on Michigan Street. The company that had built transport wagons for the Union Army and ceremonial carriages for 4 American presidents was no longer a manufacturer. In the summer of 1966, the machinery that had stamped out the Lark and the Avanti was systematically cataloged. The auction house W.M. Baker and Company organized over 1,200 lots of stamping dies, precision gauges, and heavy machine presses. Under the open cry bids on the South Bend plant floor, the physical infrastructure of a century-old manufacturer was scattered to regional component makers and scrap dealers. A 20-ton forging press sold for a record $150,000, while smaller hand tools and leftover parts inventory went in bulk to the highest bidder. Outside the tool rooms, the real estate followed a similar path of gradual erasure. By 1968, the West Side Final Assembly and Paint buildings were leased to a steel fabrication firm. By 1972, those same structures were demolished to make room for a municipal parking garage. The parent corporate entity, stripped of its automotive core, sought survival in paper mergers. In 1967, Studebaker merged with the Worthington Corporation, a builder of industrial pumps, to form Studebaker Worthington. 10 years later, McGraw-Edison absorbed what was left. The name that once carried precedence became a licensing trademark for garden tractor parts. In 1965, 2 local South Bend dealers, Nate Altman and Leo Newman, purchased the Avanti patents, tooling, and brand rights from the Studebaker estate. This operation was a low-volume specialty business rather than the return of a major automaker. Operating out of a small portion of the old South Bend complex, the newly formed Avanti Motor Corporation began hand-assembling cars. Without Studebaker's foundry, Altman and Newman made a practical compromise under the hood, replacing the original engines with Chevrolet small block V8 engines. This survival strategy kept the fiberglass coupe alive, but the industrial footprint shrank with every subsequent owner. In 1982, Stephen Blake bought the company, attempting to modernize the styling with federally mandated bumpers before bankruptcy forced a sale. Michael Kelly took over in 1986, eventually moving production out of Indiana to an aircraft parts plant in Ohio. By the time real estate developer John J. Cafaro purchased the brand in 1999, the operation was building only a handful of vehicles a year. With each new owner, the car carried more compromises. The original engineering was gradually replaced by donor parts and chassis sourced from General Motors and Ford, turning a cohesive industrial design into a hand-built collage of modern components. When the final iteration closed in the early 2000s, the Avanti had survived its parent company by nearly 40 years. Yet this survival was measured in dozens of units instead of thousands. A body design can be kept alive with aftermarket components, but the heavy industrial scale of a true production automobile cannot be sustained in a small workshop. At 635 South Main Street in South Bend, the red brick facade of the Studebaker Administration Building still stands. Constructed in 1908, the building once housed the executives, accountants, and engineers who directed the company's operations. Today, it houses the South Bend campus of Ivy Tech Community College. Students walk the same hallways where Harold Vance and Paul Hoffman once reviewed production ledgers, the structure retaining the heavy masonry and large windows of early 20th century industrial architecture. About 6/10 of a mile north, across the railroad tracks, sits the Studebaker National Museum on West Washington Street. Within its walls, the company's 114-year history is kept in physical form. The collection includes the hand-finished wooden wagons that survived the Civil War, the 1865 carriage that carried Abraham Lincoln to Ford's Theater, and the clean, low-slung lines of the 1953 Starliner and the fiberglass Avanti. Beyond the vehicles, the museum preserves the paper and ink of the enterprise, blueprints, engineering drawings, and original factory payroll records. But outside these preserved spaces, the vast manufacturing footprint has mostly vanished. The West Broadway assembly floors, where 23,000 workers once turned raw iron and seasoned oak into road-ready vehicles, have been quiet for 60 years. Where concrete foundations once held heavy forging presses and stamping dies, open ground and modern light industrial parks now sit. South Bend's relationship with its defining manufacturer is no longer measured in daily shifts, railcar shipments, or the hum of coal-fired power plants. Instead, that memory remains anchored in surviving brick walls, the silent iron of preserved carriages, and the physical objects that refuse to wear away. Studebaker's departure proved that in the American machine shop, legacy cannot buy survival once the math of scale turns against you. Yet industrial memory has a long half-life. Today, in the quiet halls of the South Bend Museum, those surviving cars still hold the alignment of the men who built them. They stand as silent, heavy proof of a time when we built things to outlast the companies that made them.